Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, I'm going to ask you what's new and exciting in your world this week, but before we do, there is something so new and so exciting in my world that we've got to start with this. You know of my love of Coke Zero, yes?
Oh, yeah.
And you know of my love of Oreo cookies, yes? I mean, even for a diabetic, I don't know what to tell you. You leave Oreo cookies out, I'm going to eat them. I don't care what happens physically to me. Well, it has been announced, he said in the passive voice, that you can soon get Oreo-flavored Coke Zero.
No way.
Way. And not to be outdone, you can also get Coke Zero-flavored Oreos.
That's just not right. Get one and dip it in the other. See what you get.
I'm telling you, man, this is like a little tiny taste of heaven. I can hardly wait. I'm looking all over for it. I haven't found any of this yet, but soon, Ant, soon, we will all be this happy. What's new and exciting in your world this week, as if you could even come close to that?
Yeah, sorry. I can't match Oreo-flavored cookies and cookie-flavored Oreo, whatever it is that you had. I've got a story here. It's a sad story in that there's all sorts of unintended consequences that people seem not to be aware of because they're having a knee-jerk reaction. And this was, you may have heard this story, in Virginia Beach, an 11-year-old kid has been suspended because another kid brought a bullet, not a gun, but a bullet, into school, showed this kid. This kid reported, as you're supposed to do, to the principal, teacher, whatever it is, but the kid who did the reporting is getting suspended because he waited 2 hours to report. He didn't report soon enough.
You gotta be kidding me.
And apparently, when you dig into the details, what happened was they were sitting down to take a standardized test, and just before the test began, the kid showed the other kid that he's got a bullet, and the test starts. The kid waits till after the test to report him. So, of course, the kid with the bullet gets suspended, but this kid gets suspended as well. And none of the adults in the room seem to understand the unintended consequences here. And there are two right off I can think of. One is, this is going to cause kids to be reticent to turn in other kids for fear that someone's going to say, well, you waited too long, 5 minutes instead of 3 minutes, so we're going to suspend you, right? So you got that problem on the one hand. On the other hand, you're going to have students who, I see you take a eraser out of your pack that might be a bullet, and I'm going to run and turn you in, because if it turns out that it was a bullet and I didn't say anything, I'm going to get suspended.
Yeah, if I'm a student, I'm not saying a thing.
You're going to have part of them not saying anything and part of them jumping at anything they see that might possibly be construed as something that they shouldn't be seeing.
And let's take a deep breath here and remember when you and I were in school, and this would have been in the, 1970s?
Yep.
What happens if a child brings a bullet to school? The teacher takes it away, gives it to the principal talks to the parent, and we're all done here.
If that. I mean, I remember when I was in school, of course, they weren't live, but lots of people had bullet keychains.
Oh, God, I guess that's right. I forgot all about those.
Yeah.
I never had them. I guess I was never cool enough for that. But this is just all so ridiculous. I mean, we all know what the problem is. We don't want to see children with weapons on school grounds. We probably don't want to see children with weapons more generally, but I leave that off to the side. But in order to facilitate our desire, we go way too far and do all kinds of stupid things.
It's this, what they call it, zero tolerance nonsense.
I mean, what do they think? He's going to take the bullet and shove it into the temple of a fellow student?
Right.
A bullet is quite useless without a gun to shoot it. I'm going to get us away from this and get us onto one of our favorite topics, Ant. Your Pope, Pope Francis. You probably already constricting on the inside as I say these words. Pope Francis has weighed in on American politics yet again.
Oh, no.
So you haven't heard what he's done.
Nope.
Unlike every other time I've brought this up, I'm going to say something very strange. Pope Francis has a pretty good point.
Okay, what's he said?
He said that Americans must choose between the lesser of two evils. He left it open as to which of the two evils was the lesser. I think we all know which way he would dip on this. But, who needs to get into it? It's interesting to me that he's finally said something that I agree with. I was going to say something reasonable, but then, all the people who are listening are going to send me hate mail. So something I agree with. I do happen to think, and we've talked about this before, and I've said this many times before as well, I don't think it's the lesser of two evils. I think what we've got is the evil of two lessers. And we're looking at an election that's just a couple of clicks down the road. If you're excited by these two choices, I don't understand you. These are not good choices. Maybe you're so conditioned to bad choices that you can look at these two and think, oh boy.
Certainly, neither one of them is the top notch that we have available to us. And the fact is, we've made the whole system such a circus that the top-notch people aren't interested in holding the job.
Well, it's not even that. It's so much worse than that. They're not even the upper echelon of their respective parties.
Right.
There are even better examples within their own parties that could have been chosen, and that weren't for lots of different reasons, given the way we've tumbled down to the finishing line on this election. But my God, when Pope Francis can take a look from afar and say, well, I guess you're going to have to choose between the lesser of two evils, and that we can't find a reason to call him, of all people, an idiot.
Well, he could have said the lesser of two evils or the libertarian.
I guess that's right.
There is another option.
And Chase Oliver, for whatever it's worth, not doing particularly well, near as I can tell.
Well, you didn't expect much, right?
No, but I expected him to do better than previous libertarian candidates, and I don't think that's going to come to be the case.
I haven't been watching his numbers. Do you know what they are?
Yeah, they're not good. It's in the statistical noise. It's so bad. And, we get to this often, and I'm sure we'll get to it again. Libertarian policies do pretty well over time. Libertarian politicians do not. People are going to have to find a way to capitalize on that. They're going to have to figure out how to work on the policies and let the politician aspect go.
We should write an op-ed piece on the two parties as a cartel. People are understanding that there's something fundamentally wrong with our electoral system. And they're pointing to various things like, we need a third party, or it's the electoral college, or whatever it is. I don't think people are understanding that those two corporations have locked out competition. That's the fundamental problem.
We should probably tee this one up for immediately after the election. I know you're right, but I think there are other things that are to be said about this. You could be a lot more right if you said a bunch of other things too.
My thoughts of late have been going to what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the easiest thing to change? For example, you're not going to change the electoral college. That requires a constitutional amendment. So let's just stop talking about that. I think the primary system is a contributing factor, but...
Oh, the primary system, oh God, the more democratic we made that, the worse the outcomes became.
Yeah, that's a heavy lift because that's within the purview of the parties themselves.
No, I don't know that it is at this point.
But you have a party, you're a corporation, you're free to set up whatever rules you want, and so they set up the rules the way they set them.
You're not, and you're not, because any number of states have required that the primaries be open, that a Democrat can vote in a Republican primary and vice versa. And if that's not a recipe for all kinds of malfeasance, I don't know what is.
But approaching that, you now have to go on a state-by-state basis. What I'm looking at here, when you talk about this cartel, we've got RICO laws. We already have a system in place to deal with corporations that collude.
And yet you don't, because who would have to enforce those rules?
Right. The same people that we're electing.
You see the problem that's woven, right? There's this old saying, and I think it's one that people should kind of utter every now and then just to remember what reality is like. The problem at the heart of things is the problem on the surface.
Yep.
When you see the obvious problem in front of you, it probably goes all the way down. Yep. It's probably no more complicated than that. And people want to turn politics into this grand cabal. And this is Trump's stock in trade, right? It's not that complicated. There's not that much to it. Mm-hmm. It's exactly what it looks like. So cut it out and get busy. The problem is people want to win more than they want good outcomes.
Right.
And why do they want to win? So they can get the spoils of victory.
And why are there spoils of victory? Because we ignored the constitutional limits on the federal government.
Yep, that is correct. And that is the problem on both the surface and at the heart of things.
Yep.
And having said that, probably time to move on to the foolishness of the week. I usually ask if you have a guess, but there's no way you've got this one in your crosshairs.
I don't know if you saw it, but your foolishness last week or the week before was people writing rubber checks, depositing them into ATM machines, and the ATM machines just happily giving them money. They thought free money.
Because an entire generation just learned what check kiting is.
Right. I sent you an article of the ATMs fighting back. Apparently, there are some ATMs that have been spitting out the fake Hollywood money, that says for production use only.
That's not an answer. If I go to the ATM and need money and it spits that out to me, I can't buy a pizza with that. Hell, Ant, it's hard to spend a legitimate $2 bill most of the time.
Yeah, well, you can imagine people were very happy when they figured out that they could hand rubber checks to the ATM and the ATM would give them cash, but they're not so happy when the ATM gives them fake $100 bills.
Yeah, but people doing reasonable things aren't going to be happy with that answer either. I mean, does the ATM know when it should give real money and when it should give Hollywood money?
Oh, no. It's just going to hand out fake $100 bills.
Boy, that is not an answer. Not an answer. But anyway, and this is, I think, going to be the very first time I ever go to Car and Driver magazine to get the foolishness of the week.
Okay, I'm all ears.
And there are any number of other outlets that have reported on this as well. But the Ford Motor Company has filed a patent with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for a system that, and I want you to really think about this, for a system that helps law enforcement identify speeders.
Ooh, they're putting speed monitoring devices in the cars.
In the police cars made by Ford. And what happens is there are all kinds of cameras and computers, and the camera identifies speeding cars in conjunction with the computer. Then it snaps a picture, and you can just mail the speeder a ticket.
Yeah.
And I'm here to tell you what's going to happen next. The government will mandate that all cars have a version of this, and speeders will be turned in by other motorists unbeknownst to them. I know this is going to happen the way I know the sun is coming up in the east.
Wasn't there a case recently, like in the past 6 months, somebody brought a case in some higher level federal court, ruled that you need something more than simply the speeding camera that's showing that your car was going faster than a certain speed, because that does not prove that the person who's getting ticketed was actually driving the car at the time.
That's right. And look, I want to talk about that for a second, because when I lived where you live now in the greater DC area, boy, Maryland had all kinds of cameras out there taking pictures of cars. And I want to stipulate that every time I got pinched, it was me. I was speeding. I'm not making up anything here. But here's what they did. They would send something to my house in Pennsylvania saying, okay, you've been pinched. You can pay this amount. And it was always a relatively low amount, like $40, $50, $60. In comparison to a speeding ticket, that's almost nothing.
Right.
And they would say, and if you pay it, there'll be no points on your license.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But if you don't pay it, you have to drive your all the way to Maryland and go to court.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I wasn't driving to Maryland. There was no way I was driving to Maryland to go to court.
Mm-hmm.
But come on. So they knew they had you coming and going. This was a money printing machine for the state of Maryland.
Yep.
I think if you want to charge a man with a crime, even a traffic crime, well, it better be legitimate.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
What's next?
This is where you say what we're going to talk about next. We have a pattern here. We do the same thing every week. Come on, man.
You wanted to talk about tariffs, and we were going to add another topic onto that.
Yeah, wealth taxes.
Wealth taxes, yeah. Okay, so let's start with tariffs, because James sent me a text saying, oh, let's talk about tariffs at the next episode.
Because we talk about tariffs in passing all the time, but we never actually talk about tariffs.
I looked up some information on tariffs, and I've taught about tariffs for 3 decades, but discovered some interesting things I didn't know.
Before you walk down that line, we should start by saying tariffs are perfectly constitutional.
Yeah, actually, they're specifically constitutional. They're listed. It's one of the authorities of the federal government.
That's right. And we're getting to that territory, and I should have said this at the Foolishness of the Week. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be.
Right.
And I say this all the time. You can have a perfectly constitutional idea that's an idiotic idea, tariffs being one of them, for example. You could have all kinds of ideas that are wonderful and perfectly unconstitutional. We're not going to talk about those today. But you see the larger point here. Just because something's constitutional doesn't ipso facto make it a great idea.
Tariffs were, back in the day, one of the major sources of revenue for the federal government.
Yeah, and the federal government needed a source of income because there was no such thing as an income tax.
Yeah, but specifically, the federal government's authorized to impose tariffs on imports, not exports. Whatever's coming into the country, the government can impose this tariff. A tariff, of course, is just a tax. We use a special name, tariff. It's no different than any other tax. It's just a tax that's specifically applied to imports coming into the country. And one of the things, I learned this, it was kind of eye-opening when I was a freshman in college, and my international economics teacher was talking about tariffs, and it's the first time I'd really thought about them. And he said, look, one of the arguments that's made for tariffs is something like, well, American steel manufacturers can't compete with cheap foreign steel, or American car manufacturers can't compete with cheap foreign cars. So let's put a tariff to raise the price of the steel that's coming into the country or the cars that's coming into the country, make them more expensive than the American stuff, and then people will buy the American stuff. And I thought, okay, I've heard that argument before. And he says, but that's not what happens. And when you think about it, of course it makes sense. Let's take an example. If an American car is selling for $30,000 and there's an equivalent foreign car that would otherwise sell for, let's say, $25,000, and we put a $10,000 tariff on that foreign car. So the foreign car, when it comes in this country, it's now going to be $35,000 versus the American $30,000. What happens? It's not that people now flock to the American $30,000 car. It's that the American manufacturers raise the price of their cars to $35,000 to match the end price of the imported car.
Because, of course, they do. And I want to just sit here for a moment because I was live tweeting the presidential debate not too long ago, and Donald Trump was off the rails, as he often is. And look, when you and I talk about tariffs, we are concentrating on Donald Trump, right? He is the mouthpiece for tariffs in the United States at this point in time.
Oh, yeah. He's the polar opposite of Bill Clinton back in the day.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, let me go further. So much of what Donald Trump is saying is based on economics as we understood it 150 years ago or more.
Yeah, economic systems which we have dismissed with the back of our hands.
Yes, that's correct. We've decided this is completely wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, this was all real stupid. But I said something. Look, everyone, the cost of the tariff is ultimately borne by the consumer. Everywhere and always. That's what happens. And I was beset upon by the MAGA crowd saying, no, the Chinese pay.
Oh, no. No, they don't.
No, you pay every single time.
What the Chinese do pay for are subsidies. So if China is going to subsidize its steel, that's its government basically paying a stipend to the Chinese steel producers to export steel to the U.S. Who's got to pay for that? That's the Chinese.
Right, but when we look at the cost of the thing and who pays it, it's the consumer here.
Yeah, it's the American consumer. Yes.
So what's really happening is you got a bunch of politicians who have said, what we're going to do is stick it to these other people. Mm-hmm. And you say, yeah, stick it to the other people. And in so doing, you just stuck it to yourself.
Yep.
And this point becomes important 10 minutes from now. But please continue.
The tariffs were the major source of revenue prior to the income tax. And so I look up what fraction of federal revenue is tariffs. Because we talk about it a lot, so you think, well, this is a significant amount of money, whatever it is. It's around 1% of federal revenue is tariffs.
How about that?
That puts tariffs in the same ballpark in terms of revenue generation as the death tax.
This is also going to become important 10 minutes from now.
Yeah, which we're constantly saying, look, why are we arguing about the death tax? It's only 1% of federal revenues. So too with tariffs. And tariffs have become, in my opinion, they're no longer an economic tool. They're almost exclusively a political tool.
Imagine that. Can you think of anything that doesn't ultimately become a political tool?
We certainly try and guide people's behavior with income taxes the way we do it, but at the end of the day, the income tax generates a tremendous amount of money the federal government needs. Not so with tariffs. We could get rid of them all tomorrow, and the federal government is not going to be any worse off.
I can visualize a bunch of our listeners thinking, what did Antony Davies just say? The federal government needs this money? And okay, no, it doesn't. We could decide not to do a bunch of that we do, and maybe it doesn't need this money. But you take his point in the common parlance, right? Federal government needs money to do the stuff it does. How's it going to raise that money?
Right.
Turns out tariffs don't raise much. And what it does raise is a thoroughgoing regressive tax. To the extent it hits anybody, it hits poorer people harder than it hits richer people.
Furthermore, the big action with the tariffs economically isn't how much money they raise. It's the perverse incentives that they create. When we protect a domestic industry by imposing tariffs on foreign competition, what we're doing is encouraging American investors to invest their money in the production of something we are not good at producing. How do I know we're not good at producing? Because the foreigners can produce it more cheaply. We would be better off investing our money in something else that we are good at producing.
We'd be better off producing something else.
Right, yeah.
We're going to call it what it is. And a lot of the reason here is the cheap price of foreign labor.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be honest about why these things happen. Labor in China or India, look, it's not like we're slapping tariffs on things that we import from the United Kingdom.
Right.
It's from places where human labor is very cheap. And you can have a side discussion on whether you believe human labor should be cheap or not. That's, I think, a perfectly reasonable thing to talk about. But that's not the point here. The point here is that the Chinese produce things more cheaply than we do. And we as consumers want to buy things at a cheaper rate than we would otherwise. I mean, who among you wants to pay 3 times as much for anything?
I think that the problem is people see this model of, well, the foreigners can produce this more cheaply because their labor is cheaper, so the American jobs now go overseas, and now we've lost the American jobs. And that's not the end of the story. What happens is other American jobs evolve in which we're better at producing. I give you a good example. David Friedman tells this story that I think is just beautiful. He says there's 2 ways to manufacture a car. One is you get steel and rubber and plastic and you shove it through a factory, and out the other end of the factory comes a car. The other way to produce a car is to plant wheat. And the wheat grows up and you cut it down, you put it on a ship, you send the ship across the ocean, and the car comes back. And really, you can argue, well, the ship goes across the ocean. That's not producing a car. That's trade. Yeah, the ship's a black box. You put the wheat on it, you get a car back. That's the same as the factory. It's a black box. You put rubber and metal and plastic in one end, a car comes out the other. So the question is, how do you want to produce your cars? Now, here's the thing. When you impose a tariff, you make it harder for those foreign cars to come back in exchange for wheat. You're not playing a game of American car manufacturers versus foreign car manufacturers. You're playing a game of American car manufacturers versus American wheat farmers, because it's the wheat farmer who's going to be hurt by that tariff.
Furthermore, people should understand this intuitively, because this is how they get everything they need. You're not producing. Look, I go in my kitchen. I didn't grow any of that food. I go into my closet. I didn't make any of those clothes. I turn on the TV. I didn't build that in my shop.
Yeah.
I went to work. I got some money and I traded that money for all kinds of stuff, which means I traded my efforts for stuff.
It's a really good point. We use this word trade, But really, trade is no different than any other transaction, except that it's happening across a political border on a map somewhere.
That's right. Every time you bought something, you traded.
When you specialize your labor, you learn a skill and you go out and you get employed and you use this skill and your employer pays you, and in exchange you go and you buy food, clothing, shelter, whatever it is. You're doing, as an individual, the exact same thing that we're telling you that countries do. You specialize your resources in the production of the thing that you're good at and go and buy the other things.
Yeah. You got any other smart things to say about tariffs?
First off, I don't think economists disagree nearly as much as the media likes to portray them as disagreeing. But nonetheless, they do disagree about things. But there are two things I would say that economists almost universally agree on. One is that raising the minimum wage does not create more jobs. At best, you don't lose them.
And when you say at best, what you really mean to say, in rare occasion.
Yes, in rare occasions, you don't lose them. But generally speaking, yes, you lose jobs when you raise the minimum wage. And the other one is countries are better off when they trade.
Yeah, that's right. And the freer that trade is, the better everybody is.
Yeah.
All right, good enough. Now, you made, I think, a pretty interesting point early on that, okay, we talk about tariffs all the time, but they're not really raising much money.
Right.
Okay. You have talked endlessly about how much money would be raised if we just confiscated the wealth of every billionaire in the United States.
Right.
And you've been endlessly fact-checked by, I don't know, self-appointed internet fact-checkers who declare that when you say we could fund the government for 8 months by taking away all of the money of all of the billionaires in the country, but we could actually fund it for 8 months and 2 weeks, you're lying.
I know. The fact checkers keep saying it's false because it's not 8 months, it's 8.5 months, or it's 9 months, or whatever it is.
Let's give those little devils their due and just say 9 months for the purposes we have before us here. If we could fund our government for 9 months by confiscating all the wealth of all the billionaires, how long could we fund the government by having an Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris style wealth tax?
Well, let's see. I don't know off the top of my head what details they were talking about with their wealth tax. Oh, you're talking about the unrealized capital gains thing?
Or we could just talk about a wealth tax more broadly. The point is that this isn't some panacea.
Oh, no.
You can't have this and then we all go, and then the books were finally balanced and we all moved on happily ever after.
Oh, no. People don't understand the magnitude of the federal spending. It dwarfs our billionaires. It dwarfs them, forget about individually, it dwarfs them all as a group. When we talked about the 100% tax on wealth, that's the unrealized capital gains tax. You could apply that unrealized capital gains tax to everything they currently have, and you fund the government for 9 months.
Anything else will be far less wonderful than that. And that's not that wonderful to begin with. And when you start thinking about this, any smart person, and I know I've lost any number of the political class here, but any smart person has to realize that if you implement a tax on any very small group at the upper echelon of earning or holding, anybody who's wealthy or making a fortune, sooner or later, and what I mean is sooner, that tax will be applied to all kinds of other people.
It will, and I'm so heartened because I'm seeing for the first time people repeating what you and I have been saying for many years, which is look at the income tax. When the income tax was instituted, it was supposed to be just for the very rich, and before you knew it was for everybody. People are repeating that now. I think there's this sense out there that this new wealth tax is going to come for the rest of us.
So what did I say was going to be important 10 minutes ago? It's all important now. Everything we said before is actually true, more or less, of this too.
Yep.
And the thing I'm heartened by is that what I would consider regular people, and I consider us to be regular people. What do I mean by that? You and I don't have Lear jets. We're not living lives all that much different from anybody else.
Here's a test. If we stop working, we stop eating. I think that makes us regular people.
That's so horrifying that I got lost on it. Here's what's heartening me. people are saying, hey, wait a minute. I bought my house for $200,000 and now it's worth $300,000. And these want to tax that $100,000 difference that I didn't put in my pocket.
Yeah.
I don't have 10 or 15 or 20% of the appreciation of my house.
People have come back here. I've seen it on Facebook where people make the argument you've just made. And then the counter is, yes, but you're throwing out a red herring because Harris's proposal is only for people who earn over 100 million or whatever the number is.
That's right. This year.
Right. Yes. And that's the thing that people have to keep in mind. Once the tax is instituted, it's very easy to ratchet it down to hit the rest of us. The difficult lift is getting it instituted.
And they will, and it will. How do I know? Look at every other tax that's ever been implemented.
Yep.
Every single time the government says, don't worry, you could stop right there. But every time the government says, don't worry, this doesn't apply to you. Yep, that's right. It doesn't apply to you today. Mm-hmm. It's going to apply to you probably 2 years from now.
Yep.
And notice, we're not even talking about 30 years from now.
Oh, yeah. With the income tax, it was 7 years.
Yep, that's right. It was designed to hit only the very top of the wealthiest group of people the world had ever known. Mm-hmm. Within 7 years, it hit everybody.
Yep.
Please, I'm not falling for this again, and I would encourage no one else to fall for it again either. So we've got 2 separate taxes espoused by 2 different parties, neither of which will, in its current iteration, raise nearly enough to do what they say that it will do.
That's right.
Well, what do you think's going to happen next?
They'll ratchet it down for the middle class where they will get some substantial money. Even then, that's not going to be enough. And
no, that's right.
Regardless of whether they collect a small amount or a big amount, what's going to happen the very next year is they're going to increase spending to match what they raised. And you're going to be right back where you started.
Because they will never bring spending down to the level of tax collected.
Yep.
They always look at that and say, well, let's spend more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happens over and over and over. So we've got 2 parties espousing 2 completely different schemes of taxation, neither one of which will work to the degree they want you to believe it will, both of which will come for you further in the days after you choose which of the 2 you think is the better idea.
Right.
These are both terrible ideas. They're absolutely terrible ideas. And if you stick up your arm and say, no, I disagree, trust me, you don't understand the thing you're talking about. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.